Hi, I'm Cary Coglianese. I'm on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I direct the Penn program on regulation. And I'm happy to talk to you today about recognizing algorithmic risks, emerging AI policy in the United States. And I'm going to give some high-level overview at the outset, then talk about a few specific policy developments, and then offer some closing remarks about the challenges related to risk regulation of AI. The development of policy in the United States today is at its very earliest stages. Most of that policy is under discussion. There's no comprehensive or general proposal by any regulatory agency to govern AI writ large like there is in Europe. Most of the attention and developments has been focused on very specific uses such as autonomous vehicles and medical devices. And much of the emphasis has been on voluntary approaches rather than mandatory forms of regulation. There are a couple of mandatory reporting requirements in the autonomous vehicles and medical device area, for example, but primarily the focus is on voluntary approaches. In other words, I think there's a recognition of AI risks by US policymakers, but so far no clear characterization of that risk and no articulation of a risk management framework for it. The current administration seems to be taking a much more cautious approach to AI than did the Trump administration. So we may start to see more developments and more regulatory controls. But we should have no illusions that risk regulation will be easy or coherent in this context. It hasn't always been in other contexts. And in this area, it has the potential to really become just ad hoc if some key questions are not resolved and uncertainties settled. Let me just highlight general policies. There is some legislation enacted at the end of last year about AI in government. It calls for a Center for Excellence to be developed to help agencies. And it called for a memo to be produced by the White House Office of Management and Budget on best practices for identifying and reducing bias in AI uses by government. So far, no signs of that memo. There is a statement issued by an independent administrative agency called the Administrative Conference of the United States that articulates some best practices and principles for government agency use of AI. Turning to what's general at play about the private sector use of AI, the National AI Initiative Act, signed January 1st of this year. It directs the National Institute for Standards and Technology to develop a voluntary risk management framework over the next 2 years. And NIST this summer has issued a request for information to help inform it in developing that framework. The focus of that request for information has been on trustworthiness concerns. Interestingly enough, though, in terms of the ethics of risk, NIST has articulated in this request for information that it views there being no objective standard for ethical values. This is pretty much it with respect to like the general AI, whether it's in the governmental sector or in the private sector. Now, when it comes to specific uses of AI, we do have at the Department of Transportation, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that has articulated through a guidance document, which is not binding, a call for voluntary safety assessments by vehicle manufacturers using AI techniques. And in July of this year, NHTSA did issue an order that requires companies that are manufacturing these vehicles to report to the government any information that they have on crashes that occur with respect to these vehicles. So there is a mandatory reporting informational requirement, but that's about it. Everything else is voluntary. The Food and Drug Administration has articulated late in the end of the Trump administration an action plan for AI used in medical devices. The medical device regulatory framework here in the US, generally speaking, even without respect to AI, it actually has some parallels with the draft AI regulation in Europe, for example. There are 3 classes or levels of medical devices, and the level of review that the FDA gives and the level of controls that are imposed upon those devices can vary depending upon how the medical device is classified based ostensibly on risk. Now, I want to show you, though, what that really means. The risk is articulated in a pretty general, flexible set of language about what would provide, for example, a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness that would show an absence of unreasonable risk and that can be fairly discerned by qualified experts in concluding that there's, again, reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy. So there's a lot of play into what categories these medical devices can go. And it's also taken quite a bit of time often for this classification process to occur. Even though the medical device framework was established in the mid-70s, there's only been about 1,700 or so medical devices that have gone through this classification process at the FDA so far. And it took decades for some devices to be classified. So far, the FDA reports treating AI under a separate category altogether for innovative devices that are of low to moderate risk. And it has announced in February of this year approval under this alternative track for cardiac ultrasound software, which one has to wonder if that's really low and moderate risk if one's looking at one's heart. But be that as it may, the FDA is expecting to announce some more specific controls and risk management practices on medical device manufacturers with respect to their AI. But this policy is in flux, and the FDA explicitly says that it will continue to evolve. The new administration, the Biden administration, seems to be taking a more cautious approach. In October, the director and deputy director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy published an op-ed in Wired magazine that called for a Bill of Rights for Americans to be protected from AI. The op-ed called attention to serious problems, to the disproportionate impacts on marginalized individuals that AI tools can have, and said that Americans have a right to demand better and more protection. And interestingly enough, to codify these ideas into some kind of presumably statutory or regulatory quote unquote Bill of Rights. So we'll have to see what happens in the Biden administration. Most recently, the Biden administration did meet with Europeans in the Trade and Technology Council meeting in September and agreed to a statement that regulatory measures with respect to AI should be based on and proportionate to the risks that these technologies pose. Risk, understood as probability times severity of harm, is appealing, and the idea that regulatory responses should be proportionate to those risks is absolutely compelling too. But there's some real questions and issues with respect to how risk-based regulation will work out with respect to AI. Because with AI, the potential harms are highly varied, from misinformation to harm to children to physical harms from autonomous vehicles that might crash. There's a great deal of uncertainty about both the harms and the probabilities. It's not clear what risk-based regulation means if we can't adequately characterize and estimate harms and probabilities. It's unclear whether risks should be treated on an basis of what's acceptable to individuals, or should we be looking overall over the population? It's unclear how much evidence is needed to determine that a risk exists, that it's actionable, and who will bear the burden of proving that harm and clearing up the uncertainties. Is it government or is it the private firms before they can go forward? There's often trade-offs between different values, the benefits and the harms, between different kinds of benefits and different kinds of concerns. And ultimately, just knowing the probability and the severity of a harm doesn't do enough. It doesn't tell regulators enough that they need to set operational standards. There are other normative or policy principles that are needed, and agreement on these really in society has yet to coalesce. Ultimately, and in conclusion, we have to be realistic about what to expect from a risk-based approach to regulation. It's perhaps a helpful heuristic to keep in the back of one's mind, but if we're going to really expect that regulation follows risk, then we've got to also recognize that there's a host of other policy choices that have to be made. Do we deal with risk on an acceptable risk level, on what's feasible to control, on a benefits cost framework? Those choices have to be made. And until we do that, we have to expect that there will probably be a lot of ad hoc decision making. That's what's been true in other areas, and I'm closing with this quotation from a paper of mine, not dealing with artificial intelligence, but with trade policy and with regulations seeking to protect dolphins in fisheries. But what's true there, I think, will be true in the area of regulating AI, and it may even be harder to characterize and to manage risks on a principled basis in the world of artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.